Sounds like you've kicked off the recording feature here, so let's just begin. The first couple of minutes here is just some housekeeping things that we can get out of the way. First of all, just want to say welcome everyone. My name is Mitch Horry with the Public Service Commission Wisconsin, and welcome to the fourth stakeholder meeting for the Focus on Energy Efficiency Potential Study. You can go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. So as we have done in the previous meetings for this process, I'm going to keep with the webinar format, and please just remain muted throughout the discussion to avoid any background noise, please. And as we've been doing with these prior meetings as well, if you've got questions that come up during the course of the presentation, please just feel free to use the chat feature, type your question there, and we'll pause several times along the way to address questions. And at that time, if you've asked a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and to provide any additional information or clarifications to your question. So next slide, please. Should have all received an agenda in your meeting invite. There's 4 topics to cover today. Kind of the lengthiest one will be the first one on the agenda, which will be a discussion of the scenarios for modeling for the potential study. So we'll give an overview there and talk through what scenarios are under consideration for this potential study update. Then the team will talk through the ramp rate subgroup engagement process, and that's building off of discussions from some prior meetings where we've changed course a little bit on how potential will be modeled and estimated, and really wanting to get the engagement of folks with the expertise to help inform the assumptions that work into the modeling. Next, an update and a discussion of feedback on the energy efficiency measures and how that feedback is being incorporated into the study and into the modeling. And then last, a data collection update on the progress there, including what's been going on with virtual site visits and where we are in that process. Next slide, please. Before I hand it over to the Cadmus team to dig into those agenda items, I wanted to take a minute to orient the group to where we are in the potential study timeline. So for those of you who have been involved over the last 6 months or so, the study kicked off in May, and we're here at the 4th stakeholder meeting. And currently the team is finishing up its data collection efforts, and you'll get an update on that, as I mentioned. And besides the data collection, the immediate work ahead of us is finishing the measure characterization effort, where the team's establishing the parameters for the measures, including things like cost, savings, lifetimes. And then next, over the winter period, that's when a lot of the modeling analysis is going to be conducted. The team's going to be running models for the types of potential that we've already covered over the course of the series of meetings so far. That includes the current policy scenario for potential and what we've called the optimized potential, where the program isn't constrained by current policy. And then for the meeting today, we'll also cover some of the individual policy scenarios that may be run that will help inform the Commission on the sensitivity of savings potential under varying policy conditions. We're not anticipating to bring this full group back together again for a few months as the modeling work is performed. It'll be covered later in this meeting, but this team will be reaching out to a subgroup of stakeholders, and that's when we're wanting to get that engagement on some of those key modeling assumptions for measure adoption that are really imperative to the modeling effort. So you'll get a sense of what that effort is and time expectations and how you can get involved later in this presentation. But otherwise, you can expect to receive email updates, and we'll keep the potential study website up to date with any key information along the way. And like I mentioned, we do expect to bring this full group back together sometime in the spring to get a look at the draft results. So that's shown on the timeline here in yellow. And then from there, the team will be writing up the report and delivering a final product for the potential study next summer. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So next, I thought I'd take a couple minutes to put the potential study in the context of the overall quadrennial planning process for the next quad of focus. This is a process that really requires some explanation, so bear with me a little bit, but I think it's important to do. So every 4 years by statute, the Commission is required to set or revise the goals, priorities, and measurable targets for focus. And with the current quad that we're in, and for the next quad, a first step, kind of a foundational component, is a potential study where we want to understand what savings potential exists under different policy and funding conditions. It provides us with insights into which measures the program could offer in the future, but it's not meant to be this prescriptive tool for setting the goals and targets. There's additional steps along the way that help define what decisions are put before the Commission and then ultimately shape what the next quad of focus looks like. So as we track along this timeline here, following the potential study, Commission staff will seek out public input on the issues to include in the scope of quad planning. And those issues kind of thought of to fall into some broad categories, including goals and priorities, cost effectiveness of programs, renewable energy, and other considerations. So within those broad categories, there's decision areas where the Commission staff seek the input of the public on recommendation for what particular decision areas should be put before the Commission. That can include which areas should be revisited that maybe had decisions in a prior quad, and any new issues that should be addressed. And from there, the Commission determines which issues it would like to include in the quad planning process scope. And inclusion of new issues is not an uncommon thing as the industry evolves, as the program evolves, and new information is available. New issues for the Commission to consider is something that happens with each period. So following scoping, Commission staff develop a memo that would also be available for public comment to discuss those scope topics and incorporates those public comments into the memo and lay out Commission policy alternatives. So that's another opportunity for public comment as the Commission considers the policy alternatives put before them. And then from there, as you might imagine, the actual savings goals for focus rely on some of those Commission directions. And so there's kind of a more robust discussion of those savings goals once the Commission provides some preliminary determinations on direction. So for example, funding allocation decisions of the Commission have an impact on practical considerations for how the program operates, and that's factored into goals. And so that can take what comes out of the potential study, and there's some calibration and adjustment to account for those types of things. So ultimately, the Commission makes decisions on all these things, including the program goals, and that'll occur in the summer of 2022. And then over the ensuing period, the program planning occurs, and the next quad of focus begins January 1st, 2023. So I just wanted to set that stage in terms of where we are in this lengthy quadrennial planning process and how this potential study works into that process. So hopefully that helps. I think it's probably just worthwhile to keep reminding ourselves of this process and where public input factors into all that too. So I can pause there and see if there's any planning process questions before we dive into the meat of the rest of the agenda. Okay. Well, that's all I had. I will kick it over to the Cadmus team to go through the rest of today's agenda.
Thank you, Mitch. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lakin Garth, and I am the modeling lead for the potential study. And today I will spend some time discussing some proposed scenarios for the potential study modeling. Just as a quick overview, we wanted to spend a few minutes discussing the purpose of the scenarios, what the intent behind scenario modeling is. I'm going to provide a reminder about what our primary reporting of potential will look like, an overview of the scenarios that we're proposing, and then get into some specifics regarding those scenarios. And so as we walk through these, we'd love to gather any feedback or thoughts or commentary about scenario modeling that you may have. In particular, if there are scenarios that you find more or less useful, or if there are scenarios for which you think we should consider as we move into the modeling phase of the project. So, Jeremy, if you want to go to the next slide. So slide 7 provides, just describes the purpose of the scenario modeling, and I think it almost goes unsaid, but sometimes it's a good reminder that potential studies are forward-looking, and this one in particular starts in 2023 and runs through 2034, and as it does consider the future, that future is inherently uncertain. A lot of things can change, and so we obviously think it makes sense to consider a range of possible outcomes when estimating potential. And so as a reminder, the 2017 energy efficiency potential study did include about 13 additional scenarios to the primary reporting of potential at that time. And these scenarios included changing global variables or global assumptions with respect to how we estimated economic potential. And then, of course, those assumptions then flow down into the achievable potential at that time. And examples of things that we changed were differing carbon values, differing discount rates, looking at the impact of using a different cost test as the primary determinant of economic potential, combining these factors into scenarios that we called combined effect scenarios, and then looking at adjusting modified TRC thresholds. We also looked at a couple of different budget scenarios, and then finally we looked at a set of scenarios that impacted technical potential with respect to residential screw-based lighting. At the time, there was some uncertainty around the ISO backstop standard and what it included. And of course, here we are 3.5 years later, and that uncertainty still exists. The intent and the purpose of the scenarios is to provide additional value to the Public Service Commission and its stakeholders. And really, we hope to provide more insight into which policy levers are at the PSC's disposal and how those policy levers affect potential. These scenarios will also provide data related to the magnitude of those policy choices. And I should add that those data are also comparative, so we can look and see how changing a different policy lever or a different assumption affects the overall potential relative to other assumptions. And ultimately, these scenarios will provide very detailed information for Quad 4 planning considerations. So finally, one thing I will mention is that in the 2017 study, we did consider a rather large number of scenarios, and we may wish to consider reducing these. A more focused number could ensure, that changes in potential are comparable, and it would also help streamline reporting. Obviously, there's a practical consideration of how much time it takes to generate the different scenarios, and there's also consideration of how much information is digestible. And if we feel like we have too many or not enough scenarios, that's obviously feedback we'd like to gather as well. On slide 8, I just wanted to provide a quick reminder of how we're planning to do the primary base analysis reporting in the potential study. And so as Mitch alluded to earlier, we're looking at optimized potential and current policy potential. And the optimized potential is analogous to the maximum achievable from the previous study. And really, it's the cost-effective energy efficiency savings that are attainable with minimized implementation constraints. And so we provided some additional detail around optimized potential in the third stakeholder meeting 2 months ago. But I just wanted to provide a reminder that that is one of the two primary potential reporting that we'll be doing. And the other is the current policy potential, which would be a subset of optimized potential, constrained only by annual budget amounts based on current focus funding levels. Slide 9 begins to describe or provides an overview of some of the scenarios under consideration. And so I'll say at this point, we've had internal conversations within CADMAS and with the PSC regarding possible scenarios. Again, nothing's been determined yet, but I did want to provide an overview of our thinking and hope to gather your feedback. And then in the next 3 slides after this slide, I'll walk through these in detail. But again, in terms of possible scenarios, we do want to consider the levers that the PSC has at its disposal, including discount rates, the cost effectiveness test, carbon values. And to that, we also want to consider looking at differing funding levels. So those different funding levels would take us outside of the current policy potential. We also may consider looking at different measure level cost effectiveness thresholds. And then 2 other possible scenarios, avoided transmission and distribution costs. Currently, avoided or deferred transmission and distribution costs are not part of the cost effectiveness screening that is performed in the annual reports or annual evaluations, nor were they included in the previous potential study. And so we may wish to consider a scenario where we estimate the impact of including deferred or avoided transmission distribution costs on the potential. And then finally, with respect to screw-based lighting, there is obviously still some uncertainty around whether or not the Department of Energy will re-implement or consider updates to the previously proposed federal standard, which is not yet taken, which is obviously not yet gone into effect. And so some of the considerations here, we're looking at trying to estimate sensitivity of the potential to various inputs, providing some value to the planning process, and then considering the likelihood of occurrence for them in some of these scenarios. And I listed some, important, what I find to be important reporting considerations. Again, I just suggest limiting the number of scenarios to a reasonable number to help make the analysis more digestible and to really focus on the most essential, impactful, and informative scenarios. Jeremy, I know slide 10, we start to go into the scenarios in detail, but I did see a question pop up, and I'm happy to pause and answer that question. I don't see if I can see it right in front of me.
I can tell you. It's from Aaron Monroe, and it's the questions about current policy potential and whether it considers the 60-40 split or a rule carve out.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Aaron. And so far internally in our discussions, we do intend to have the current policy potential mirror the 60-40 split between the sectors. I personally am going to need a brief reminder of what the rural carve out is. Presumably that is just a set amount of funding, but Aaron or Mitch, could you provide a quick reminder of what you mean by rural carve out?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is really going to matter for the analysis, but we do hold about 8.1 million out, and it's specifically targeted only to customers in certain rural zip codes. And it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more. There are more barriers to reaching those customers, and I think it's extra funding to kind of help overcome some of those unique barriers in rural areas. And so it's a little bit less. I mean, if you look at it from like there's a little bit of a higher cost of acquisition, and that's what that's intended to overcome.
Sure, and thank you so much. I think the best way for me to answer that question is to say we don't we haven't up until this point explicitly planned for a rural carve out consideration. And I think what I mean by that is when we've planned to report potential, we're really doing so on a statewide basis for all the zip codes, all the utilities who have focus eligible customers. I never want to add to our workload, but what may be reasonable here is I don't think we'd want to necessarily estimate potential at a specific zip code level. But if there's interest in trying to do an estimate of potential, taking the statewide potential and seeing how that translates into potential for rural customers, I think that's something that we could definitely consider, and I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail, how we can go about doing that.
Well, and this is just, kind of one other thought is, maybe this is kind of speaking to Mitch's point earlier, where we, because, that depends on the commission making certain decisions about funding allocation, that this is sort of lives in that step in between the potential study and, when the goal, like how that kind of translates more directly into a goal,
Right.
So that might be probably the more appropriate, maybe place to sort of determine that.
Sure, and that makes a ton of sense to me. And Mitch, I'll just offer, for the work we do, it obviously the primary reporting is statewide. But if there's mutual interest between the PSC and its stakeholders at seeing what the statewide potential would translate to for rural customers, and if that's if that's data and information that would be useful in the quad planning process, I think we could incorporate that into our analysis.
Yeah, this is a good one to flag maybe for some more in-depth discussions with Aptum on this, because regarding the 60-40 split, that's kind of been an approach that's persisted over time, because there's a requirement that the benefits of focus are kind of evenly distributed based on contribution. So that could be interpreted a little bit differently. What I would want to know more about is with things like this rural carve out, what do we assume? Do we just assume the same funding level? What if we don't get that, the commission chooses a different amount or no amount? Is it harder to model on the front end or to make adjustments on the back end? That's kind of where I'd want to have a little bit more clarity before I can know for sure.
Okay. That sounds good to me. So we'll flag that. And Aaron, thank you for your question. So Jeremy, I think that the next slide we start to wade into into a lot of detail over the course of the next 3 slides. And so, on slide 9 was really an overview of the scenarios under consideration. Slide 10 and 11 really drive into more specifics around each of these different scenarios and provide some possibilities. So I'll just start with this table on slide 10 and say that in the furthest left-hand column, where it says 2021 scenario, that's just describing the name of the scenario that we'd be considering in the current potential study. The input column provides a very brief description of how we may modeling that scenario potential. The third column says baseline input value. And so really what baseline input value just means is, what are we assuming when we estimate either optimized potential or current policy potential. A fourth column, type of potential initially affected. And so some scenarios are going to affect, if we think about that classic hierarchy of technical and economic potential and so on, certain scenarios are going to affect a level of potential upstream from other scenarios. And so that just, this column provides a description. And then the final 2 columns just describe if we considered a scenario in 2017, what the input was, and then what the sensitivity in the final column was on the overall 12-year potential, both electric and gas. And so here in the first line, we're proposing to consider a funding level scenario, or actually 2. One that would consider increasing current focus funding levels by 50%, in a second scenario, which would consider basically doubling current focus funding levels. We did not consider this in the previous potential study, and this would really affect the optimized potential that we're planning to report. The second line looks at deferred transmission and distribution costs. And so we plan to run a scenario where we include these in the 2021 potential study. And then in the primary reporting that we're doing, these would not be included since they're not currently part of the approved focus on energy benefit cost test. And this would, of course, affect economic potential and then by extension, optimized and current policy potential. The last line, the Energy Independence and Security Act backstop timing. Again, this is with respect to screw-based lighting. And we currently are still working out the details of the timing in terms of which years we may consider for accelerated compliance versus most likely compliance. Again, and this really does impact technical potential and then by extension, economic and optimized and current policy. And then specialty bulbs, again, were not impacted in 2017, but the one scenario that we did consider in 2017 did delay that ISA backstop implementation. And then we can see the effect of those 2 scenarios in the 2017 potential. Jeremy, I see we have a couple of questions. So before I move on to slide 11, maybe we can take those.
Sure. First one from Scott Blankman. How do the scenarios approach the allocation between energy and demand, which I believe is 60-40? Also, a second question, given the funding scenarios, how will the possible scenarios assess PSC's potential budget increase, which may double? Possibly we've just addressed this in this table, but do you want to see about the first part? And
Yeah.
Scott, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I think you did address the second question with the 100% increase.
Hey, Scott, this is Lakin. Thanks for your question. I just want to make sure I understand the part about the allocation between energy and demand, because I think it's an interesting question. And so, you know, the 60-40, I think, as Mitch described it earlier, is intended to, intended to represent the, the funding levels based on a 60-40 basis are tended to mirror the contributions of business and residential customers. And so is your question related to how the scenario considers the allocation of energy potential versus demand potential, or am I on the right path there?
Yeah, and maybe someone from the PSC can expand upon this a little bit more, but I believe that there is the 60-40 allocation between residential and industrial commercial customers, but I also believe that then there's a further allocation as to how the benefits, I think, are quantified or given credit for, that allocate 60%, I think, to energy sort of savings and 40% to the demand side. And I know that there has been, in the decision-making process, questions about whether or not it should be 60-40, or other stakeholders have indicated support at times for 50-50. And I was just kind of curious as to how, given the scenarios that you're talking about here, if that will help provide more information to commission staff, program administrators, and stakeholders on how to understand the value of when the energy is being consumed and ultimately saved. So that was kind of the nature of that first part of the 60-40 question.
Hey, Scott, this is Mitch. I can jump in and try to answer this, and if there's anybody else on the commission who wants to help, they can. The commission doesn't allocate funding, or they haven't allocated funding for the program towards specifically achieving energy or demand savings. The issue that's been put before them in the past has been a little broader, and how would you like to emphasize how Focus operates in order to achieve either energy savings or demand savings? And so with the current quad that we're in, the commission elected for goals to continue to be based on prioritize reductions in energy use, and then have more emphasis on those savings as opposed to peak demand. So the way that that's kind of manifested itself is in program delivery and the types of measures that are prioritized, and I believe also in kind of the level of the goals for demand. And it's not so much this percent of this dollar has to go to trying to get demand savings. It's kind of in the structure of the goals.
That's helpful.
And Lakin, we had a question from Kathy, and it is confused about how funding affects optimized potential. That's all potential, so funding should not affect it. I think funding only affects budget potential.
Yeah, that's
Lakin, did I lose track of from the last? I get confused about the new terms we're using for that, but isn't optimized everything?
It is. You're right, and I think that's probably a typo on our behalf on this slide, Kathy, where optimized is really not affected by the funding level. It's really, the baseline input value is current policy because that's constrained, and so whatever we consider in terms of the funding level, so like increased funding level scenario, would basically, move north of the current policy potential. And so I think that's really a typo on our slide.
Because those two funding levels are just going to show you what increased portion of everything could be achieved with increased funding.
That's correct.
So it sort of gives us like tiers toward that optimized. Okay.
That's correct. Yes. And my apologies on that typo there. So we'll get that fixed when we can put, when we update the slides on our website. Jeremy, were there any other questions?
Not yet.
Okay. So slide 11. Slide 11 presents differing scenarios under consideration that directly address some of the policy levers that the PSC could potentially exercise, including looking at varying carbon values in the modified TRC test. And again, we're looking at possibly two different carbon values, including one based on a market value and another based on a social cost of carbon value, with the baseline, of course, being what the current value is. And then in the two far right columns, you can see that we looked at 3 carbon scenarios in 2017, and we can see what the relative impacts were to the base case potential when we varied those inputs for electric and gas. The second line shows proposed or possible scenarios for changing discount rates, which would, of course, affect economic potential. And similarly, we can see that we ran scenarios like this in 2017 and what the relative impacts were. Of course, going to a 0% discount rate would increase the economic potential by increasing the present value of those benefits since they're not being discounted, whereas increasing the discount rate would reduce economic potential by reducing the present value of benefits because they're discounted at a higher rate. And then the third line, we looked at a couple scenarios previously, and they're under consideration again for looking at different cost effectiveness tests. And so, the primary test used for estimating economic potential is a modified total resource cost test. And the modified just means, of course, it does include an assumption around a carbon value. And the two scenarios under consideration are societal cost test, which would then again take into additional non-energy benefits, including health impacts that were incorporated as part of the 2019 evaluation, and then a utility cost test. And then we did consider these two scenarios in 2017, and we can see their relative contributions to increasing potential, the sensitivity. And I'll note that on the gas side, it was a rather large increase when looking at the utility cost test. Again, the primary difference between the modified TRC and the utility cost test is that we're not considering customer costs or incremental costs when looking at the utility cost test. And so there was a measure or two that were borderline cost effective under the UCT scenario and not cost effective when looking at the modified TRC in 2017 on the gas side. And that's why there's such a large increase in potential there. Finally, slide 12 presents two scenarios that we included in 2017 and, may, if I had my druthers, may de-emphasize these two for the current potential study, where the first one was we looked at lowering measure level cost effectiveness thresholds. And we can see what the impacts were in 2017. And then of course, this sort of combined effects scenario where we changed not only the cost test, but we changed values for specific inputs. And I think, admittedly, I find these scenarios to be a bit duplicative when we consider their sensitivity, in the sense that I think you can project similar sensitivity ranges when looking at different cost tests, and then differing values for some of the economic inputs. But certainly wanted to include them here because I understand stakeholders may have a different opinion and may wish to include these in the current potential study. So that is that's the last slide in the section related to the different modeling scenarios. Again, we present all these for consideration. We certainly look at any feedback you may have around the completeness or lack thereof of these scenarios, if there's anything missing that we should consider, if there are any scenarios that we should consider altering inputs. We're certainly grateful for your time and willingness to provide feedback on these. Jeremy, on slide 13, I think just indicates that we've reached the stopping point here and hope to gather any feedback that folks may have.
And I'm also happy to navigate back to any of these table slides if people want to those. Question from Kathy. Kathy,
Sure.
feel free to just.
If you want to go back one slide, I appreciate that the measure level one isn't. This one just strikes me as really important. First, I look at how big those numbers are when you look at a 0.5 measure, and after all, the Aptum team isn't accountable for every measure being cost effective. They're accountable for a portfolio being cost effective. So it feels like we lose a lot in what's economic by having measure level cost effectiveness. I wonder if there's a different, instead of doing a scenario, like given that it's the whole portfolio, not each measure, I start thinking about, well, maybe you should just put it at 0.75 for each measure in the portfolio or some. I'm just concerned that we're losing a lot there when I look at particularly that top line of 21% of economic potential on the electric side and more than a third of it on the gas side because we're not bundling measures. And I would love Aaron or somebody from Aptum to jump in here who thinks about those numbers more than I have.
Well, the TRC has been very high for years and years. I mean, it's typically well above 3, which by just that the nature of such a high TRC means we're leaving a lot of potential on the table. A lot of stuff that's over 1. So yeah, that it. I see what you're saying, and I agree that. But again, I guess I wonder. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on. If the TRC starts to slip down, does that send? I don't know. Because it has been so high over time, I'd like to see a target sort of set that we can adjust to instead of always trying to push to make it higher and higher. But because it does lead us to not to for example, we're sunsetting our appliance recycling program right now.
Well, and I just think about measures like residential retrofit measures, which with natural gas prices where they are going to be marginal if they even but you aren't going to go into a house and do sidewall insulation alone. You would couple it with a bunch of other stuff, and together in theory, it comes out over 1. I'm just concerned that this screen, the way that we're saying every measure has to have a benefit cost greater than 1 to have economic potential is cutting off a lot of economic potential here, as illustrated by this sensitivity. So at a minimum, I guess I'm advocating to keep that sensitivity, but I really would like a better solution than that, because that is in an appendix somewhere that frankly only 4 of us look at. I mean, it's not really representing what is potential very effectively.
Yeah, Kathy, this is Levi. Do you kind of mean that like maybe it would be useful to have the baseline be something below 1?
Yes, Levi, thanks for
So
like
by default,
making my words like make sense to other people. Yes, maybe the baseline should be 0.75.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point that like the program is not beholden to make sure every measure has a TRC or cost effectiveness above 1. So if there are probably things in the program right now that would fail this filter, but we are including it, and so there might be a little misalignment between kind of what the study shows as economic potential. Well, I guess the study is kind of agnostic, right? It's going to spit out the numbers according to the rules we give it, but the point still stands that a measure level filter of 1 probably kind of ends up excluding some measures that we might actually want to include. And so a lower baseline might help include those at least in that slice, the economic potential, and then that theoretically kind of bigger chunk will be subject to all the subsequent steps, but that would at least just be a little more inclusive. I think that's an interesting thought. Maybe a little more of a technical question on here too. Does the measure level cost effectiveness, do you kind of include a little estimate on some of the fixed delivery costs and things like that would kind of, if those are not included at a measure level, you would kind of assume that your cost effectiveness is a little below that 1 if you kind of had a portfolio of measures. So does that 1 mean a 1 including the costs of delivering the programs, or a 1 just kind of excluding that and just talking about the measure itself?
Yeah, this is Lakin, and thanks for your question, Levi. And in the 2017 potential study and what we've proposed so far, there is a program administrative cost adder to each measure. Obviously, that when we look at the overall, way that the TRC is estimated, program administration costs are included. It does not include, obviously anything related to an incentive payment. When we've looked at doing utility cost test scenarios, then obviously in that scenario we drop the incremental costs from the equation and just consider program administration and incentive costs. And so yes, there is some program administrative costs baked in when we look at estimating economic potential in the base case scenario.
Okay, yeah, so that kind of 1 really does align with a 1 at a portfolio level too. So I think I would kind of, that the point that Kathy raised about, it's still interesting to see how much gets sliced off if we were to allow to dip a little below that. I think that's a good point.
Hey, and
I'm open to different ways to look at that too.
I just wanted to see if I'm connecting the dots here. does this get back to Aaron's question, kind of about the rural carve-out, where, if we have an assumption for a measure, but that means the actual cost to deliver that measure is different in different places, or depending on how it's delivered, is that something that's kind of baked into this idea too?
I think it's somewhat of a different question, right? Because the program administrative cost adder that goes into the modified TRC calculation is pretty broad. I think we look at specific adders, at a sector level, and so generally speaking, I'm going to speak in very broad, sweeping terms here. It's a little bit more expensive to administer residential programs than it is commercial, than it is industrial. And so the adder may be slightly higher, for residential measures compared to commercial measures, but we aren't going any deeper than that. Like we're not looking at varying administrative costs for customers that are hard to reach or may live in rural areas, or for measures that may have struggled over time with uptake relative to other measures, right? And so it's fairly broadly applied, Mitch.
Okay.
And I'll add, one thing that I don't think we did, maybe we did in the 2017 study that we could consider this time. I hear two things. I hear, that there's some value perhaps in retaining measure level cost effectiveness threshold as a scenario. And then B, I'm hearing, well, what if, instead of looking at it as a scenario, what if we dropped our base case assumption for what that cost effectiveness threshold is? Personally, I'm more inclined to keep it as a scenario than to drop the baseline or base case input value. Other people may have a different opinion, and I'm sure we can come to resolution there. But one thing we can do is to obviously maybe do a better job in reporting what the overall benefits and costs are. So rather than just solely looking at, an overall TRC for an entire sector or portfolio, we can slice and dice those up and look at it by fuel type and by sector, and show what the total present value of benefits are relative to the costs. So Mitch, I think there's a few ways we can add value here. Ultimately, if we were to change that base case cost effectiveness threshold, the risk we run there is, it deviates from what we've done in the past. That may not be that big of a deal to some people, but it does create a little bit of a disconnect between the previous methodology. And obviously it would include some measures that are, at least according to today's avoided cost forecasts and savings data, aren't cost effective. So we bring the overall potential present value benefits down a little bit, net benefits down, but we can certainly take that into consideration as we move forward.
Were there any other questions about the different scenarios, or scenarios that are particularly interesting to folks? Any comments in addition to questions? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, we can move on. Of course, if something comes to mind later on, there's another Q&A period at the end of this presentation, and we can always come back to it. Next, we wanted to go over our ramp rate stakeholder engagement process. So over the last few meetings, we've had fairly extensive discussions about how to estimate optimized potential as a subcategory of the overall potential estimates. And we had proposed that we engage stakeholders with to assign the various adoption S-curves or ramp rates to the measures that are in the potential study. And so this next group of slides goes over our proposal for how to engage you all in that process. So again, we are looking at about 6 to 8 ramp rates or adoption S-curves that can be assigned to measures in the residential, commercial, and industrial and agricultural sectors. And to help with that process, we are looking to identify a subgroup of participants in this overall stakeholder group and focus on industry experts that have a high familiarity with energy efficiency measure adoption over time. And we will be looking to identify the experts for this subgroup sometime in December. And once that group has been identified, we would ask that the entire subgroup meets as a group to review some measure groupings, and I'll just discuss that in a second, what that means, to review some criteria for assigning ramp rates to measure groups and to review the ramp rate shapes themselves, which will differ depending on the speed at which they assume measures to be adopted over time. And we are looking at grouping measures because as we know, and as you all know from reviewing the measure list, there are a lot of measures in our study. So in order to make the assignments, we would be looking at grouping them into about a dozen different groups by technology and efficiency level in order to make the assignment process more streamlined. And so we would ask that the subgroup meets sometime in January following our outreach and our grouping and have kind of an overall briefing. And then following that overall meeting, have the breakout groups meet sometime in February, following our modeling of economic potential. And before the group meets, probably virtually by email, we would already have done some initial assignments so that folks would have something to react to, and then the experts in each group can review those assignments and just make any notes or discussions about changes that they would like to see. And so some members of these subgroups may not be familiar with all of the specific measure groups and may focus on particular ones. That's okay. We would look to invite a breadth of experts to make sure all groups are covered. And again, we would look for a pretty fast turnaround in this process, about 2 weeks, to ensure that we can continue with our modeling process. And then we may have some follow-up discussions to resolve any conflicts. So, for example, if different ramp rates have been assigned to the same measure groups in different sectors, and seek any feedback to resolve these conflicts. And that would be after the first draft is completed. And then the next step immediately here is to move into identifying members of these subgroups. And I have a question here from Roger. Can you address where educational facilities would fit? Roger, do you mind elaborating on that question for me, please?
Just trying to determine where, as a stakeholder, the educational facilities, K-12s, higher ed, would be considered a part of any of these groups, or are they a separate group, or how do they fit within this process?
They would be in the commercial, for the commercial subgroup. Since education is a part component of that commercial sector.
And that would be the same for other governmental facilities as well?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't see an obvious fit. But okay.
Okay. And then Kathy, we're having a hard time seeing your question.
Yeah, I'm just so I understand this. So there'd be one residential subgroup, and they would determine the ramp rates to be used for heat pumps and setback thermostats and lighting and appliances and everything in the residential sector.
Correct.
Okay, I have some concern about that because I think it dilutes the expertise of I mean, I think hopefully work groups can work through that, but I worry that we're going to get like slow ramp rates for everything because that's like the model everyone can agree to. This seems like I have concerns that what will come out of here is consensus, but it's not necessarily, it's not going, I guess maybe I need to just talk to Aaron about how to make sure that everyone from the focus team is going into this with an eye toward ambition kind of thing, because I think this could equally be as disappointing as the old method.
Hi, Kathy. This is Lakin, and I think I hope it's not disappointing. I'll start there. I don't want it to be disappointing for anyone, and I think what I wanted to say is that if someone is an expert in one area of the residential market, but not every area, that they feel comfortable just providing feedback where they do feel their expertise is warranted, and that we wouldn't force anybody to speak about something, you know, with which they're not familiar. And so my hope is that by getting people to provide feedback where they're comfortable, you know, that we'll have a reasonable outcome and resolution around what the ramp rates are. You know, and of course, we're going to provide sort of an initial reminder of what we did in the previous study with data where we have it to inform those ramp rates. And I hear your concern. I think the challenge that we're faced with is, you know, there's a timing challenge, right? Because we've got to produce some results, and then we've got to pause and gather feedback. But the other challenge is, you know, there are a lot of measures in the study. And I personally wanted to not have, you know, dozens of subgroups, if that makes sense, and rather have fewer subgroups with members who have, you know, who have broad expertise and specific expertise to speak to these things.
And like, and I appreciate that, and I don't disagree that I don't know that I would tell you should have 100 subgroups. But part of what I'm inferring here is that there's maybe an HVAC ramp rate where I would say there should be a smart thermostat ramp rate and a heat pump ramp rate and, I don't know, an ECM furnace ramp rate, and those are not the. To me, those don't look the same, and so there is some level of complexity that should be involved here to kind of get us at the things that we see moving really rapidly in the market. And I guess I would just plant in people's heads that the only data for market adoption need not be past EE program adoption. Things like smartphones were adopted really quickly. There's not a legitimate reason to believe that some technologies like smart thermostats perhaps can't move into a bigger adoption pretty quickly, kind of thing. So I want some level of disentangling there, not just HVAC, because that's not one technology.
You're right, and I totally understand, and it's not our intent to apply a single ramp rate broadly based on end uses, knowing that there are equipment types and measures within that end use that have vastly different rates of adoption, right? And so, you know, I don't expect that we'd have the same ramp rate for gas furnaces as we would for knee wall insulation. They will differ. I think what we're trying to do is.
But what about gas furnaces and heat pumps?
I don't.
Where I guess I want some commitment that everything that's HVAC doesn't fall in the same bucket.
I think what Jeremy is presenting is we'd like to have a subgroup based on HVAC, people who are very familiar with that market, but we're not going to apply the same ramp rate for one piece of equipment to another, you know, blindly or without data or without input from a stakeholder group. Like they can certainly have varying ramp rates. I would assume I'd have to go back and look at what we did in 2017, but I don't think we applied the same ramp rate to gas furnaces that we did for central air conditioners. And so, you know, I can commit to you that we do take these in consideration at a very detailed level. Last time we applied them at a measure level, and so they were different for different equipment types. We didn't have, you know, dozens and dozens of ramp rates. We had a set of a dozen ramp rates, but we applied them each at the measure level. And you know, and to Roger's question earlier, I think it's a valid question. One other thing that we can consider is, you know, if there are specific markets or segments that should vary their ramp rates, then we can certainly consider that. And education is a good example, and so are low-income customers in the residential sector.
Is that helpful, Kathy?
This is Erin.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question too, regarding the residential component? Will there be, like, how will we characterize multifamily buildings in this? Are they lumped in with residential? We do have a lot where you see they're kind of mixed use, a little bit of commercial. How is that going to be categorized?
Yeah, this is Lakin. So we do a full segmentation. And in particular, we vary the counts of customers by field type and by segment or by building type. And so measures that are applied to the multifamily segment or sector would have varying costs and would have varying savings based on those applications. And then the possibility certainly exists that we could even vary ramp rates at the segment level. Again, we've got that capability. Is that helpful, Erin?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Oops, I was on mute. So some additional information about this process. So Cadmus and the PSC, we will look to contact potential members based on expertise in the coming weeks. I think in terms of a time commitment, it will likely vary depending on the engagement of individual measures, but I think we estimate about 3 to 5 hours for going through the assignments, and probably about an hour to an hour and a half for the first meeting where we go over everything. Were there any additional questions about this? Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Aquila to talk about measure feedback. And Aquila, you can just let me know. Well, you only have one slide, so I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, everyone who provided feedback on the measure list. We provided an initial measure list a few months back, and we received feedback from 5 different organizations, and it was roughly 28 comments relating to 25 existing technologies and 3 emerging technologies, and all of the feedback was very helpful, and we'd gone through and looked at and reviewed all of the comments, and so it was very helpful. So thank you, everyone. And I'll just jump in here that the feedback really covered all the sectors, but most of the feedback really focused on the non-residential sectors. And some of the comments or proposed measures did require us to do additional research on a few of these technologies to make sure that these measures were applicable to the region, as well as to make sure that there was enough data to do proper measure characterization, that for some of the emerging technologies, for example, we just wanted to make sure that there was sufficient data available to estimate costs and savings potential, for example. As a result of all of this, we added new measures to the measure list. Some examples include smart water heaters. This is similar to, say, a smart thermostat, but just for your water heater, as it tracks and adjusts based on occupancy patterns. We also added more non-residential boiler control options, such as high turn-down burners. And one of the emerging technologies for refrigeration included ultra-low temperature freezers with Stirling engines. That was one that we also included. There were some of the feedback also had for proposed measures or comments were already covered by existing measures. Some of that related to some of the industrial measures or motor upgrades or commercial lighting measures. And those technologies, for the most part, different names or were broad enough that covered the proposed measure or comment that was provided. But all in all, the feedback and our responses to the feedback were sent out to the group last week, and that can be found on the Focus on Energy Potential Study website. At this time, we've updated the measures measure list. It includes a total of 724 measures. We are still working on the measure characterization at the moment, but we've really are moving now, incorporating all the primary data collection as it becomes available. So with that, we plan to complete the measure characterization by the end of the year. I'll pause here if there are any questions before I hand this back over to Jeremy.
I have a quick question maybe about measures. This is Levi. Could you, I don't know, well, I'll just ask and you decide if it's worth. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of risk maybe of what happens if, say, a measure is not included in the characterization? We, say some amazing new thing comes out in the spring and we missed it. What does that do to the overall findings? Or if we miss something that maybe would have been useful to include, or kind of the other way too, if there are measures on the list that end up not really being that important, what does that do to the kind of bigger picture output of the study?
That's a good question. I think there are sort of two ways of thinking about this. The first is, I guess, it depends on the technology that could happen in the future. A lot of the newer technologies that are showing up, they are either competing with an existing technology that's already on the market, but they may be cheaper or they may be have more savings. And so while there may be a difference in cost or savings of a particular end use or technology, the measure list in itself will still cover that potential. It's just not going to be accounted for that particular technology per se, because a lot of these technologies they compete for that same socket, lighting socket, for example. But it's a valid question. I think the other answer to this is why potential studies or program planning occurs every few years, every 4 years, for example. That's accounts for these changes in technologies that we can't necessarily foresee in the future. And so that's the other part of this. While we look at a long-term potential study of in this case 12 years, these studies do occur more often to account for those changes over time. But it's a good question. I think we want to be as comprehensive as we can, but we want to also be realistic with current technologies that are available.
Yeah, thank you.
Were there any other questions or comments about the measures or measure feedback? Okay. Also want to note a comment or from Roger Price to consider educational facilities as a standalone subgroup. And we certainly note that, and I will say that we will see how to make sure that we can address the component of education in this process, and may follow up with you directly if that works.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to data collection. An update here. As a reminder, we essentially had four different ways that we've been collecting data. For the residential general population, we worked with Qualtrics to pull together a representative panel of Wisconsin residents, and conducted email surveys with that panel. And we have completed that and have received 600 completed surveys in the residential sector for both single family and multifamily homes. And again, we were looking at collecting key equipment saturation and end use data in those surveys. We also conducted a phone survey for income qualified customers, specifically 70 in the single family homes and 70 in multifamily homes, and essentially collected similar data as with the general population survey, but pre-screened all the respondents to meet the income qualified criteria. And we have completed those surveys. In the industrial sector, we conducted in-depth interviews with experts to collect information about remaining opportunities for key industrial end uses, and we completed 11 of those 10 interviews. We also surveyed in the agricultural sector, split between dairy and non-dairy subgroups, and completed 70 surveys there. And again, we supplemented our extensive research from our 2016 effort with those surveys. We also conducted phone surveys in the commercial sector, targeting all 9 segments. We completed 604 of the 630 planned surveys there, again, targeting key equipment saturation and end use data. The reason that we didn't complete all the entire target is because we put the healthcare sector, well, we stopped collecting data in the healthcare sector due to the impacts of COVID and essentially healthcare providers becoming extremely busy with COVID cases. So for the surveys and interviews and for the panel, we have essentially completed our data collection, despite some challenges surveying during an election time in a battleground state, and also some more difficulties with rising COVID cases during this data collection effort. We also have been working on conducting virtual site visits. So as a reminder, we had opted not to do in-person site visits due to the considerations with the coronavirus and COVID. And so instead have been doing these site visits virtually, which means that our engineers are on the phone with someone on the other end at the facility and essentially do a walkthrough with using that person's smartphone to record and take photos of the site, focusing primarily on lighting equipment and collecting more detailed information than what we can collect with a phone survey. We piloted this in kind of early summer, and then went into full data collection as the situation changed in Wisconsin with the COVID cases, as illustrated in that graph. And as a result, it has been more challenging to complete these virtual site visits than we had anticipated. It's both become more time intensive to schedule sites, finding people to speak with at the sites, particularly offices and sometimes retail businesses. And also, we are experiencing a really high frequency of sites dropping out after the time has been invested to actually recruit that site to participate. So we're about at a third of sites dropping out after recruitment. So currently, we are at 33 completed office visits, and we have currently 10 scheduled for the next, I think, over the next 8 days or so. We have 8 of the 68 planned retail sites completed, with, I believe it's about 16 in the pipeline, and then even more challenges for schools. So moving forward with the virtual site visits, we are going to focus now, or have been focusing primarily on recruiting offices and retail sites, with a focus on obtaining a high confidence and precision in those sectors. And then once we've achieved that, and we can measure that through the actual data that we've collected, we may circle back to schools, although it may be the case that we rely on other data to characterize the measures in those sectors. So that is our update on virtual site visits, and we're looking to complete data collection, now the virtual site visits in December. Our next part here is Q&A and next steps, including anything about data collection. So I'd like to open up the discussion to any additional questions that may have come up, anything we haven't discussed yet, any observations before closing out. It's an open floor, and feel free to chat or just unmute yourself and speak. All right. Well, it doesn't sound like we have any additional questions. Our next meeting is going to be in April when we present draft results. Of course, in the interim, we have our ramp rate engagement process, and Mitch will be able to provide any email updates as needed throughout over the coming months. Of course, we we'll update our website. We will post a meeting and a recording of this meeting there in the next day or so. And so I think that's it, unless anyone else from Cadmus or PSC wants to add any additional thoughts. Okay, well, in that case, thank you all very much for your engagement, and we look forward to further discussions with you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.